The town bell began at dawn and did not seem to understand when to quit. Every 12 strokes it paused, then found new breath, and the sound rolled over the roofs and alleys of Dry Creek like a stubborn tide. By the third round, there was no one left sleeping. Men tugged on boots with cracked heels. Women pulled shawls tight against the chill, and the street filled with the scuff of soles and the quiet clink of tack. Somewhere a mule brayed like it too had been summoned to witness a reckoning. Ruth Callahan stood in the shadow of the freight office, trying to make herself smaller than the doorway. The wood smelled of pitch and old tobacco. Last night she had thought if she slept here pressed between wall and barrel, the sun would forget to rise and the bell would forget to ring. The sun rose just the same hard and colorless as a coin, and the bell did not forget anything at all. She had one dress, and it was not the sort of fabric a person ought to stand up in when the town gathered to judge. The winter had pared her down to angles, and every part of her that had once been rounded and generous now told a sharper story. Her hands were a map of new work and old worry scabbed knuckles and the ghost of piano calluses under the skin. She wiped dust from her mouth and tried to slow her breathing, but breath kept coming quick like a bird trapped in a stove. "You sure you want to do this?" Miss asked a voice that tried to be gentle and failed. Mr. Meacham, the freight agent, stood with his hat in both hands. He was the kind of man who wore regret like a second shirt. "I could say your train west left before dawn," he offered. "I could say you took a seat and went on to Carson." Ruth did not look at him because if she looked at kindness too long, her courage might fail. "The sheriff will not believe you," she said. "And if he did, Jericho Slade would not." The bell tolled again, and her mouth went dry. "It has to end somewhere." Meacham nodded, but his eyes said he did not agree. He shifted his hat from one hand to the other, opened his mouth, shut it, and then stepped aside. "When you are ready." Dry Creek had never been much of a creek, and today it was only a name. Dust wavered in the street like thin steam. The crowd had already formed a ring in front of the livery, where the sheriff liked to plant his feet in his authority. Merchants leaned in their doorways. Boys climbed the hitch rails until their mothers hissed them down. On the outskirts where the street met the first tired sage, the men from the Red Jack Saloon sat their horses and watched with a lazy hunger that made the air colder. The sheriff lifted a hand to quiet the bell, and for a strange moment the silence felt louder than the sound had. His face had the worn leather look of a man who had laughed less than he planned to. He cleared his throat. "Ruth Callahan," he said, his voice measured like he practiced it in a mirror. "Complaints have been filed. Accusations have been printed and posted. Until a federal man arrives, you will remain under the protection and supervision of this office." His eyes slid briefly toward the men from the Red Jack and then away. Protection did not always mean safety. Everyone knew it. Jericho Slade, owner of the Red Jack, eased his black mare forward and smiled with a mouth that had too many teeth for decency. He wore a vest that sparkled like a stage and a ring that caught every splinter of sun. "Sheriff," he said, "easy as syrup. Protection and supervision are such fine words. But the lady has debts, as I understand it. And a man in business cannot indulge poetry when numbers are owed." Ruth kept her chin where it belonged, steady and unbowed, but her stomach nodded. Numbers, she thought. They never ask how numbers are made, only how they are paid. The bank book in Boston had once held columns that ran clean and neat until a hand that was not hers scratched lies into the ledger and put her name to them with a flourish. People believed the flourish and not the truth that lived beneath it. "Sheriff," said a woman from the front row, "a laundress with red hands and a redder temper. She is not a thief. She is a fool for trusting a rich man." "There is a difference." A murmur rustled through the crowd, agreement and scorn braided together like rope. Slade did not look at the woman. He did not look at Sheriff either. He looked only at Ruth and at what might be purchased when others chose not to see. "What is owed can be worked," Slade said. "I can find a place for her. Feeding tables, washing floors. Folks at the Red Jack are always thirsty." He let the sentence stand open like a doorway that led to a room nobody wanted to enter. Ruth felt the freight office wall at her back, even though she had already stepped away from it. Words gathered behind her teeth and would not organize themselves into anything useful. She thought of her father the morning the telegram arrived with its terrible calm. The afternoon their trunks were packed, and the evening she understood that names in Boston were not shields, only targets. She thought of the ledger and the music room, and the way stones sound when they strike water under a bridge. Then a voice cut across the square low and unhurried, as if the speaker had all the time in the world and saw no reason to waste any. Set a number, the voice said. If it is fair, I will meet it. If it is not, I will not. The crowd parted like people do when they are not sure whether they are making way for a miracle or a mistake. The man who stepped through was tall, but not the sort of tall that made a show of itself. His hat brim shadowed his eyes. His coat had been mended in places that wanted mending. The horse behind him was dun-colored and patient. The man rested one hand on the saddle the way you rest your hand on the shoulder of a friend. Name, asked the sheriff, cautious. He had seen enough sudden men to know to be careful with quiet ones. Eli Mercer, the man said. I run cattle north of Pinion Ridge. I count fences and calves better than I count people, so you can save your speeches. But I can add and I can see when the math of a thing is crooked. Slade's smile went thinner. We are talking about debt, Mr. Mercer, not arithmetic. It is all arithmetic, Mercer said. You will say she owes what suits you. The sheriff will say something in the middle. I will say what I can pay without cheating my stock through winter. We will land somewhere between lies and hay. Sheriff's mouth twitched like he almost enjoyed that. He named a figure that made the crowd exhale. It was not small. It was not cruel. It was the sort of number that would empty a pocket built on seasons and sweat. Mercer's eyes lifted at last. They were a gray that did not hurry to judgment. He looked at Ruth as if he had found her in the wreck of a coach and needed to know where she hurt before he tried to lift her. I will pay it, he said, but I will not own her. I will settle the town's claim. So the law sits quiet, and then I will offer work the same as I would to any person who wants a roof and wages. If she leaves the next morning, I will tip my hat and feed her horse. If she stays, we will see what needs doing and how to do it fair. That is my offer. If the town does not like it, they can pass a different hat. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of arguments that did not quite dare to be spoken. A farrier cleared his throat. A boy on a rail stopped swinging his legs. The laundress folded her arms and nodded once, like a verdict had been reached, and it pleased her. Slade laughed, but the sound did not fit the bright vest. It slid away and left him colder. Generous, he said, and foolish. You do not know what she carries toward your place, along with her trunk. Mercer did not blink. Everybody carries something, he said. Sometimes it is a child. Sometimes it is a grave you cannot set down. Sometimes it is a ledger someone else wrote your name into. I can mend fence. I cannot mend rumors. Sheriff, take the money or do not. I have calves to pull when the thaw comes, and a stove that eats wood faster than a preacher eats soup. The sheriff rubbed the bridge of his nose, sighed through his mustache, and held out his ledger like a man surrendering to weather. If you will sign, he said. Mercer counted coin that flashed dull and honest, then put his name where names go. The bell, as if it had been waiting for a cue, gave a single soft note and fell silent. Ruth did not move. Her legs had become language she could not make sense of. Mercer stepped closer, but did not reach for her. He stood at a distance that said this world had taught him what distance could mean. Miss Callahan, he said, please understand something before you answer. I am not buying you. I am buying you time. What you spend it on is yours to decide. The street and its faces blurred. Not from tears, not yet, but from the sudden rush of air into a chest that had forgotten how to expand. Ruth found her voice quiet and raw. And if I cannot cook, she said, if my hands remember sonatas better than dough, if I break more dishes than I wash for the first month, if I wake the house with bad dreams, then we will eat stew the way I already do, Mercer said. I will burn my own biscuits while you learn not to. And if you wake the house, the stove is there, and coffee is cheap if you do not mind it weak. I have a spare room with a door that sticks after rain, and a dog that snores. I offer these truths so you know I am not a miracle, and my place is only a place. Ruth drew one long breath and let it out slow. Her fingers had been fists without her knowing. She opened them. She nodded. All right, she said. I will work. I will pay back what you spend when I am able. And if I leave, I will leave in daylight. Daylight is best for leaving, Mercer said. He tipped his hat to the sheriff, to the crowd, and even to Slade, which seemed to gall the man more than a refusal would have. He untied the dun from the rail and loosened the second lead rope on the saddle horn. The laundress stepped forward and shrugged off her shawl. "Take this," she said, and when Ruth hesitated, she added, "It is not charity if it keeps the wind from lying about who you are." Ruth wrapped the shawl and found a warmth in it that went past wool. They walked to the edge of town where the dust met the first honest grass. Behind them, the ring nodded the way crowds do when a story does not end the way they expected. Ahead of them, the road climbed toward Pinyon Ridge. The sky had decided to be blue after all. The bell, exhausted, said nothing. That is when Ruth heard the second sound, too small for the town to notice. The faint jingle of a bridle where there should have been only wind, the light scrape of a shoe against stirrup leather. She looked back without turning her head. On the far side of the street, just beyond the last storefront, a horse and rider kept to the shade and matched their pace. The rider did not wear a star, but the metal on his coat caught light like one. Mercer did not look. Ruth did not point. Both filed the sound away in the part of the mind that knows storms long before the sky agrees. The road out of Dry Creek was less a road than a scar cut into the earth by wheels and hooves that had passed too many times without thought for those who would follow. Dust rose and settled on their shoulders, a second skin that no shawl could fully block. Ruth walked beside the dun horse, her steps uncertain at first, then steadier as she let the rhythm of hooves guide her. Mercer kept silent, the kind of silence that carried weight, but not cruelty. They climbed toward the ridge where the land tilted and the sage grew sparse. From here, Ruth could see the whole of Dry Creek behind them, a scatter of wooden buildings leaning like old men in the wind. The bell tower looked smaller, now less commanding, almost ashamed of its morning work. She wondered how long it would take for gossip to gallop ahead of her, for whispers to reach the ranch before she did. "Mercer's place," he said finally, "is 2 miles ahead. Valley side. Water runs clean there. Good grazing. House is not much to look at, but it has a roof that keeps rain out. Most days." Ruth wanted to ask questions about his cattle, about his life alone, about why he had risked coin and reputation for her, but her voice felt raw, like it had been scraped against stone. Instead, she asked the smallest thing. "Do you always count miles instead of hours?" Mercer glanced at her, one eyebrow lifting. "Hours are tricky," he said. "A trail can stretch them. Miles stay honest." She nearly smiled, and the fact startled her. Smile had been a stranger for so long it felt dangerous to invite it back. The road narrowed as it wound into pine. Shadows deepened, cool and green, a mercy after the naked heat of the flats. Birds darted above their wings, cutting through silence. Still, Ruth kept hearing that other rhythm, the faint jingle she had noticed in town. She looked over her shoulder more than once, but the curve of the trail hid everything behind them. Maybe it had been nothing. Maybe Slade had simply let them go. But her stomach would not believe in maybe. They came to a creek, narrow but fast tumbling over rocks slick with moss. Mercer dismounted and held the reins steady. "Water is cold," he said. "Step careful." He offered his hand. Ruth hesitated. Her fingers remembered what it felt like to be grabbed without permission, to be treated like coin in a pocket. But Mercer's hand stayed open, waiting, not reaching. After a moment, she placed her palm in his. His skin was calloused, rough as pine bark, but his grip was steady, not crushing. She crossed the water, licking at her shoes, and when she reached the far bank, he let go without delay. "Thank you," she said, surprised at how much the words meant. "No debt in thanks," he replied. The valley opened before them like a secret kept between ridges. Grass rolled soft and high, dotted with cattle that raised their heads at the newcomers. The cabin sat near the bend of the stream, smoke curling from a chimney that looked uncertain of its own strength. A barn leaned slightly but held. Fences zigzagged across the land, patched in places, but sturdy enough to do their work. Home, Mercer said simply. To Ruth, it looked both smaller and larger than she expected. Smaller because it was rough plain without the polish of the houses she once knew. Larger because it was alive, each beam and fence post standing like testimony to hands that refused to quit. As they approached, a dog with ears too big for its head bounded from behind the cabin, barking. Once, before deciding enthusiasm was better than suspicion, he circled Ruth's tail, whipping like a rope in wind, then flopped onto his back in invitation. "This is Brim," Mercer said. "Eats too much, sleeps too much, and thinks everyone who comes near is family." Ruth crouched, her shawl slipping, and rubbed the dog's belly. Brim sighed in bliss as if declaring her acceptable. The simple welcome unknotted something tight in her chest. Mercer's voice drew her back. There's rules here, Miss Callahan. Her shoulders tensed. Rules often meant chains. First, he continued, no one raises a hand in anger under this roof. Not to stock, not to dog, not to people. Second, work is work. We both do it. I do not keep score. Third, you can leave when you wish. Doctor does not lock. Ruth stared at him, waiting for the hidden edge. But his tone was plain, like reciting brands on cattle. Why would you spend so much for someone who can walk away? She asked. Because folks ought to walk because they choose, not because a rope drags them, he answered. The words struck her harder than any insult ever had. For months, she had been treated as less than her own will. Now a stranger, a man of few sentences, gave her back the right to choose. It was heavier than she expected, this sudden freedom. The afternoon settled, long light slanting across the valley. Mercer showed her the cabin, 2 rooms, a loft. Furniture carved more from need than beauty. Dust lay thick, dishes unwashed, the mark of a man who knew cattle better than cooking pots. You can take the small room, he said, pointing. It belonged to my brother once. He died young. Bed is still good. Ruth stepped inside. The room was plain, with a quilt faded by years, a shelf holding 3 books, and a window that let in light thick with motes of dust. She touched the quilt, feeling threads worn thin by time and memory. Behind her, Mercer cleared his throat. I will see to stock. Supper is beans. If you want something else tomorrow, we will find it together. She turned to answer, but he was already at the door, Brim at his heels, the man and the dog stepping into twilight. Ruth sat on the bed, her shawl still around her shoulders. Outside the window, cattle grazed, indifferent to her turmoil. For the first time since Boston, no walls pressed close, no eyes weighed her worth in coin or rumor. She should have felt safe. Instead, unease whispered at the edges. Because in the stillness between bird calls, she thought she heard again the faint clink of metal, distant but deliberate. Someone else had followed the road to Pinyon Ridge. Night settled over the valley like ink poured slow from a jar. The last light clung to the ridge tops, then slipped away, leaving the cabin lantern to carve a small circle of gold against the dark. Ruth sat at the rough-hewn table, her bowl of beans cooling untouched. Mercer ate with the calm rhythm of a man used to silence at meals. Brim snored at the door, one ear twitching at every unfamiliar sound. You will need boots, Mercer said finally. Those shoes will not hold through a week of fence mending. Ruth looked down at her feet, still damp from the creek, crossing the fabric, fraying where leather should have been. I have no money, she said. You have hands, he replied. Hands are currency enough here. The simplicity of it both comforted and frightened her. In Boston, value had been measured in jewelry, dowries, and last names. Here it was measured in whether you could carry water-split wood or face hardship without quitting. She nodded, pushing the beans around her bowl. I will try, she whispered. Try is all any of us do, Mercer said, standing to clear his dish. The cabin creaked as if in agreement. Outside, coyotes called, their voices weaving through the pines. Ruth found herself listening too hard, searching for another sound, the jingle of a bridle, the scrape of stirrup leather she had heard on the road. Her skin prickled with the certainty that someone lingered just beyond the tree line, watching the glow of the lantern. When Mercer stepped outside to fetch more wood, Ruth followed, wrapping the shawl tight. The valley smelled of resin and damp earth. The stars burned hard and close, as if the sky were lower here. Mercer stacked logs by the door, his movements steady. You hear something, he asked without turning. She hesitated, then said yes. On the trail, I thought someone followed. Mercer's jaw shifted like a man grinding stone between his teeth. Slade has men who follow for him. If one trailed us, he will wait for the right dark. The right dark, Ruth repeated the phrase, chilling. Mercer's hand rested on the rifle, leaning by the door. You should sleep. I will keep watch. But she could not sleep. Long after the lantern was doused, she lay in the small room with eyes wide, the quilt pulled to her chin. Each creak of timber became a footstep, each brush of wind against shutter a hand reaching. When at last exhaustion dragged her into dreams, they were twisted with auction bells and Slade's smile. At dawn, Mercer was already outside splitting logs. His face gave away nothing but dark smudges beneath his eyes betrayed the night. Brim barked once at the tree line, then quieted, tail stiff. Ruth stepped out, hair loose, breath clouding in the chill. She followed the dog's gaze. Between two pines, a scrap of cloth fluttered, caught on bark, dark fabric, torn as if from a rider's coat. Someone was here, she whispered. Mercer lifted the scrap, studied the weave, then tucked it into his pocket. Not a traveler's cloth. Saloon velvet, he said. Slade. The name hung heavy in the morning air. He does not like to lose, Mercer said, and he will not forget a debt he thinks unpaid. Ruth felt her stomach turn. Am I worth this trouble, she asked bitterly. Mercer paused, resting the axe in the block. Worth is not decided by Slade, or Boston, or debt. It is decided by what you do when men like him try to tell you otherwise. His words should have steadied her, but fear coiled tighter. She had run from Boston with her father, run from accusations and whispers. Now, even in this hidden valley, trouble had followed. The day passed in labor that left her hands raw, hauling water. Hanging damp clothes, helping Mercer mend a section of fence torn down by cattle. Each task reminded her how little she knew, yet Mercer never scolded. He showed her once, then let her fail until she learned. By evening, her muscles burned, but a strange pride stirred with the ache. Still, when shadows lengthened, Ruth found herself glancing toward the ridge. Each dark tree seemed to hold a watcher. That night, Mercer set a second rifle by the hearth. Use it if you must, he told her. Do not fire unless you mean it. She touched the cold iron, its weight too heavy for hands that once played sonatas. But something in her chest answered, I will if I must. As the fire crackled low, she realized what frightened her most was not Slade's men beyond the trees. It was the question Mercer had not asked, the one she feared he already knew. What crime had driven her west, and what truth waited to unravel if Slade's whispers reached the law? The wind rose, carrying with it the faint ring of a horseshoe striking stone somewhere in the darkness. Mercer lifted his head, eyes narrowing. They were not alone on the ridge, and soon whoever followed would step from shadow into firelight. The third night came with no moon, only a spill of stars sharp as glass. The cabin glowed faint, its chimney smoke curling like a signal against the dark. Ruth sat at the table with Mercer's old ledger, open, practicing letters by lantern light. Her hands shook, but the steady scratch of pencil gave her a sense of order she had not felt since Boston. Outside, Brim's bark shattered the calm. Once, twice, then a growl that did not fade. Mercer was already on his feet, rifle in hand. Stay behind me, he said, voice low as gravel. Boots crunched in frost just beyond the porch. Then a knock, not polite, not hesitant, but deliberate, claiming the night as its own. Mercer opened the door halfway, enough to frame his tall shadow against the firelight. Evening, a man's voice drawled. He wore a velvet coat that caught starlight like oil. Slade's colors. Two figures loomed behind him, mounted, their outlines hard against the ridge. What do you want? Mercer asked. Conversation, the man said. Boss figures you and the lady ought to hear his offer again. Ruth's stomach tightened. She stepped closer, though Mercer lifted a hand to hold her back. I am not interested in his offer, she said louder than she felt. The man smiled thin, showing tobacco-stained teeth. Interest is not required, miss. Debts don't care whether you like them. Mercer shifted his stance. Her debts are settled. I paid in coin. Coin spends. The man shrugged. But memory's harder to spend away. Slade remembers she belonged on that platform, and he don't take kindly to losing auctions. Brim snarled, hackles raised. The riders' horses stamped nervously, sensing the tension. Mercer's voice sharpened. Tell Slade if he sets foot on this land, I will answer with lead, not words. The messenger leaned closer into the lamplight, his face creased with mock pity. You think you can keep her safe out here, Mercer? You don't even know what she's running from. Ruth froze. Her throat tightened. The words felt like claws, raking open wounds she had buried. Mercer's jaw hardened, but his eyes flicked to her only once. She saw the question there unspoken. The messenger laughed, stepping back. Reckon we'll let the law do the talking. Word is marshals might be interested in a certain Miss Callahan. East sends long shadows even this far west. With that, he swung into the saddle, and the three figures melted into the trees as quiet as wolves. Silence fell heavy. The fire popped in the hearth. Ruth's knees wanted to give, but she stood stiff, her fist pressed white. What did he mean? Mercer asked softly. She could not answer. Not yet. Words jammed in her chest, each one heavy with shame. Mercer's gaze lingered steady but not pressing. When you are ready, he said. Then he set the rifle by the door, as if the matter were closed for now. But Ruth knew it was not closed. Slade had spoken her secret into the night, and the echoes would not die. Sleep refused her. She sat awake, staring into the dark where the men had vanished. At last, she whispered into the quiet in Boston. They said I was a thief. The fire cracked, but Mercer did not stir from his chair by the hearth. Only his voice came calm and rough. Did you steal? Ruth closed her eyes. No, but they believed I did. And the man who lied is powerful enough that believing him was easier than believing me. Mercer nodded once. Truth's a stubborn horse. Some folks don't bother breaking it. Tears burned her eyes, but she swallowed them. I thought if I came west, I could bury it. Now Slade is digging it up. Mercer leaned forward, the firelight etching the scar along his jaw. Slade can dig all he wants. Bones don't scare me. But if the law comes, we'll face it straight, not hiding. Ruth wanted to believe him, but she had seen how quickly crowds chose the loudest lie over the quiet truth. Outside, an owl called its wings, brushing air like the turn of a page. Ruth gripped the edge of the table, steadying herself. The night had shown its teeth. Daylight would show its price. For now, all she could do was sit in the small pool of firelight, listening to Mercer's calm breathing, and wonder how long before the past she carried caught up enough to burn this valley too. The days that followed moved with the stubborn rhythm of ranch life. Fences demanded mending, cattle pushed against rails, the creek threatened to flood after spring rains. Ruth rose with dawn, her hands blistering on ropes and buckets, her back aching in ways no fine parlor chair had ever taught her. Mercer worked beside her without complaint, and when she faltered, he showed her again, patient as stone. The work should have dulled her fears, but each sound from the ridge made her startle. Sometimes it was only wind in the pines, other times the scrape of hooves too far away to be chance. Slade had not returned in person yet. His shadow prowled the valley unseen, but felt. Still, something shifted inside Ruth. Where once she might have hidden from labor, she now forced her hands to hold steady to learn. She burned a pot of beans, laughed at her own mistake, and started over. She dropped a bucket, cursed under her breath, and tried again. Mercer never mocked. You're learning, he said, and the words felt like a rope tossed across floodwater. One evening, while hanging damp laundry on the line, Ruth caught her reflection in the wash water. Sun had browned her skin, wind had tangled her hair. Her dress was patched twice over. Yet the face looking back was not only the frightened woman from the auction block. There was a new set to her jaw, a fire in her eyes she barely recognized. That night, Mercer found her at the table with one of his brother's books, open lips moving as she whispered the lines. Shakespeare, she explained quickly, embarrassed like she had been caught stealing sugar. Mercer's mouth tilted in what might have been the beginning of a smile. Books don't eat hay. They're safe to keep. His quiet acceptance nearly undid her. No one in Boston had trusted her judgment once the accusations began. Here, a single sentence from a rancher meant more than 100 polite assurances ever had. But peace in the valley proved fragile. On the 6th day, smoke rose from the ridge. Mercer saw it, first narrowing his eyes. Controlled fire, he said. Men burning brush. But the way his jaw tightened told Ruth he didn't believe it. By noon, riders appeared at the far pasture. 3 silhouettes against the glare. They lingered, watching before turning back into the trees. Neighbors, Mercer muttered, though his rifle rested close to hand that night. Ruth could not sleep. She stood at her window, staring at the ridgeline silvered by moonlight. When Brim growled low in his throat, she whispered to herself, "This is my home now. I will not run." The next morning, Mercer asked her to ride with him into town for supplies. The thought made her chest tighten, but she nodded. Hiding would not keep Slade away. Dry Creek looked different this time. Eyes followed her, some with pity, some with suspicion. Whispers stirred like dry grass. Slade had been busy planting seeds. At the general store, Mr. Patterson leaned across the counter, his voice low. "You best be careful, miss. Man in town's been asking about Boston." Offered coin for stories. Ruth's hands trembled on the sack of flour. She forced herself to meet his gaze. "And what did you tell him?" "Nothing," Patterson said firmly. "My wife says trouble sticks only if you feed it, but others might not be so careful." As they loaded the wagon, Ruth saw women crossing the street to avoid her men shaking their heads. She bit her lip until she tasted iron. Mercer said nothing, only tightened his grip on the reins as they left town. Halfway home, a note lay pinned to their fence post, flapping in the wind. The handwriting was sharp, cruel. Property can change hands. Debts never die. Ruth's blood ran cold. Slade was no longer satisfied with whispers. He was promising escalation. She tore the note down, crushed it in her fist, and met Mercer's eyes. I will not let him drive me out. Mercer's gaze held hers steady and unyielding. Then we fight, he said simply. Ruth had never fought anything beyond gossip and lies. But as the valley darkened behind storm clouds, she understood survival here meant more than endurance. It meant standing ground even when the ground itself threatened to give way. And Slade with his velvet and gold tooth had no intention of letting them rest long. The storm broke not with rain but with flame. It was a Sunday evening, the sky streaked with copper light, the air heavy with the smell of pine. Ruth was shelling beans at the kitchen table when Brim's frantic barking ripped through the stillness. Mercer burst through the door. A moment later, his face set hard. Barn's burning, he said, already reaching for buckets. Ruth ran after him into a world gone red. Smoke curled skyward like a devil's hand, sparks leaping from the barn roof to the dry grass below. The cattle bawled in panic, hooves thundering against fence rails. Neighbors who had seen the smoke came running with buckets, their faces grim. Ruth grabbed the largest pot she could find, filled it at the stream until her arms screamed and staggered toward the blaze. The heat hit like a wall, searing her cheeks, filling her lungs with ash. Mercer's voice cut through the chaos, steady commanding, directing men into a bucket line, shouting orders to drive the cattle clear. Over here, Ruth called Tom Bradley, the rancher from the north spread. His eyes, sharp even under soot, flicked toward Mercer before landing back on the fire. This ain't natural, he muttered between heaves of water. No lightning, no careless sparks. Someone set this. Ruth's stomach clenched. She didn't need the name spoken. Slade. 2 hours they fought, passing buckets until their arms shook, until skin blistered and hair reeked of smoke. Ruth coughed until her throat felt raw, but she refused to stop. When at last the flames died to blackened timbers and smoking ruin, she collapsed by the creek hands, blistered body trembling. Mercer's shirt was scorched, his face streaked with soot, but his eyes found hers across the wreckage. You did good, he said simply. She almost laughed at the absurdity. Good when everything smelled of loss, but the words landed deep. For the first time in her life, she felt she had earned them. Neighbors lingered, muttering about sabotage. Bradley shook his head. Same kind of man who'd burn a neighbor's barn is the kind who thinks women are chattel, he said. We all know who that points to. Mercer's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Ruth saw the calculation in his eyes. Accusing Slade openly without proof would bring bullets before justice. That night, Ruth lay awake in the small room, the smell of smoke thick even inside. Each creak of timber sounded like a match struck in the dark. Her hands ached from burns, but her fear ached deeper. Mercer's voice came from the hearth where he sat watch with rifle across his knees. Fire can take a barn, he said quietly. It will not take the will to rebuild. Ruth swallowed hard. He spoke of wood and nails, but she knew he meant her too. Yet as the night stretched, another truth burned colder. Slade would not stop at barns. He wanted to break more than fences and beams. He wanted to break her. And if rumors from Boston reached the valley before proof of her innocence, did the fire outside might be nothing compared to the one waiting in men's judgment. When dawn finally came, painting the valley in pale gold, smoke still hung over the blackened ruins. Mercer stood among the ashes, silent. Ruth stepped beside him, her voice hoarse but steady. If Slade thinks fire will drive me off, he's wrong. Mercer's gray eyes turned to her, something fierce sparking in them. Then we're of one mind, he said. Ruth realized then that she had crossed a line without knowing it. She was no longer just a guest on his land. She had claimed it as her fight too. But somewhere beyond the ridge, Slade was already planning his next move. And this time he would not send smoke as warning. He would come himself with teeth bared. 3 days after the fire, the ridge grew restless. Birds flew low, their wings beating quick, and Brim would not stop pacing the yard, nose to the wind. Ruth felt it in her bones before she heard it, the drumbeat of hooves coming steady through the pines. Mercer stepped onto the porch with rifle in hand, his silhouette rigid against the first light of morning. Slade rode at the front black horse, shining like oiled coal gold tooth, flashing when he grinned. 2 men flanked him, broad and mean, their guns already loose in their holsters. They drew up just beyond the gate, dust rising around them like smoke. Morning Mercer Slade called voice sweet as poison. Shame about your barn. I hear accidents like that happen when you keep what ain't yours. Mercer's reply came calm steel under gravel. The lady's no man's property. Her debts were paid. Slade leaned forward in his saddle. Debts like hers don't vanish with coin. Not when Boston's still sending whispers west. Funny thing, marshals are mighty curious about a certain Miss Callahan. Ruth stepped onto the porch before Mercer could stop her. The shawl clung tight around her shoulders, but her voice carried strong. I am not hiding Jericho. If you've got truth, speak it plain. If you've got lies, spit them where the wind will take them. The crowd from town had gathered behind, drawn by rumor and the promise of spectacle. Their murmurs rippled like dry grass in wind. Slade thrived on it, his grin widening. She's wanted back east for theft, he announced loud enough for every ear. 5,000 stolen. A hanging crime in some places. You really think this rancher can keep her from the rope? Ruth's heart pounded, but she stood her ground. My crime was telling the truth about a thief. He wore finer clothes than me, carried a finer name, and the world believed him. If you call that guilt, then every honest soul in this valley should be afraid. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with judgment, waiting to tilt. Mercer broke it with the steady weight of his words. Every man carries shadows. Some let theirs rule. Others fight them back with work and decency. I've seen how Ruth stands against fear, against fire, against the weight of lies. I'll stake my land, my life on her character. Slade sneered, hand brushing the butt of his pistol. Big words, Mercer. Let's see if your lead matches them. Time slowed. Brim growled, townsfolk gasped, and the morning sun cut the ridge in gold. Slade's hand twitched for his gun. Mercer's rifle rose smooth, practiced. But it was Ruth who moved first. She stepped forward, voice cutting through the tension like a bell. You claim the law, Slade, then show your papers. Show the warrant that says I am guilty. The demand struck like a thrown stone. Slade froze. His men shifted uneasy. The crowd murmured again, sharper this time, smelling the weakness. No warrant came, no papers. Only Slade's fury, raw and naked. You'll regret this, girl, he spat, jerking his reins. His horse reared hooves, striking air. He wheeled away his men, following their retreat, raising dust that glittered in the morning light. The crowd remained, their eyes shifting. Some still doubted, others began to nod, whispers turning in her favor. Mercer's rifle lowered, his jaw still hard, but his gaze softened when it found hers. You did not flinch, he said. Ruth's knees trembled, but she forced a breath. Maybe I am done running. The townsfolk began to disperse talk, buzzing like bees shaken from a hive. Slade had been wounded not in flesh but in pride, and Ruth knew wounds like that could fester into something worse. Yet as Mercer laid a hand gentle but firm on her shoulder, she realized a new truth. She was no longer just a woman surviving another man's cruelty. She was a fighter, and the valley had seen it. The sun climbed higher, burning the last of the smoke from the air. The reckoning had come, but the war was not finished. Slade's smile still haunted the horizon. And Ruth, though steadier, now understood freedom was never given once. It was won again and again at dawn, with every stand a soul chose to make.